It was October 12th, 1990, the kind of Reno night where the neon glow felt brighter than the stars, where casino skylines hummed with noise, while the neighborhoods just a few blocks away stayed quiet enough to hear your own footsteps. 18-year-old Valerie Knox wasn't chasing the noise. She was chasing a future. She was an art student, soft-spoken, gifted, and carrying dreams bigger than her small off-campus apartment. Her professors said she saw the world differently. Her roommate said she loved too deeply. Her parents said she was good in a way the world didn't deserve. That afternoon, she'd been sketching along the Truckee River, filling her notebook with the kind of work that made her believe someday she could leave Reno behind and build a life that wasn't shaped by luck, casinos, or chance. But that evening, routine carried her back to campus. An art history lecture, a quick stop at the library, a promise to her roommate that she'd be home before midnight. She kept every promise she ever made, except this one. The library cameras saw her at 10:38 p.m., packing her heavy textbook into her canvas bag, brushing a curl behind her ear, smiling at someone off screen. She pushed open the double doors and stepped into the cool Nevada air, a 5-block walk she'd made dozens of times. 5 blocks. That was the distance between her life and the darkness waiting for her. By morning, the city woke up to panic. Her canvas bag was found tossed near an overgrown patch of juniper bushes. Pages from her sketchbook were scattered through the grass like someone had ripped them out in a struggle. Her pencils lay cracked under a pair of tire tracks. And Valerie? Gone. Her mother screamed when police knocked on their door. Her father collapsed against the wall, begging them to check again. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't leave. In that moment, Reno changed forever. Not because an 18-year-old girl went missing, but because the city realized it never truly knew who walked its streets after dark. Have you ever trusted a familiar road, only to realize it never cared about you at all? She thought she was safe 5 blocks from home. Are you? Subscribe, because not every neighborhood is as safe as it looks. The first hour after Valerie failed to return home felt strange, but not alarming. Her roommate, Liana, paced the small living room, telling herself, "She's fine. She probably stopped to talk to someone." That was Valerie, friendly enough to pause for a conversation, patient enough to listen, trusting enough to believe the world wasn't waiting to harm her. But by 1 a.m., fear stopped whispering and began screaming. Liana drove the route herself, circling the same 4 streets over and over. Her headlights swept across empty sidewalks, trash bins, and rows of parked cars. Nothing. When she reached the patch of bushes near Pinecrest Road, something caught her eye. A piece of canvas fabric flapping in the cold wind. She slammed the brakes, stepped out, and walked toward it with shaking hands. Valerie's book bag, ripped open, her sketchbook pages littered across the dirt like someone had tried to erase her voice. Liana fell to her knees. Her scream tore through the night, so loud a neighbor turned on their porch light, scanning the darkness as if expecting a shadow to run. Police arrived minutes later, but answers didn't. Detective Marcus Hale knelt beside the scattered drawings. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes told the truth. This wasn't someone wandering off. This was someone taken. At 3:12 a.m., Valerie's parents arrived at the scene. Her mother collapsed against the patrol car, clutching the last sketch her daughter made, a drawing of the river, smudged with dirt and fingerprint marks that didn't belong to Valerie. Her father walked toward the bushes, ignoring officers telling him to stop. He whispered her name into the darkness. Nothing answered. That moment, that silence, became the beginning of a 2-year nightmare. What would you do if the world stopped looking for someone you love? The sun rose the next morning, but it didn't bring comfort. It simply made the nightmare visible. Officers taped off the area near Pinecrest Road while neighbors gathered on porches, whispering in the cold light. Valerie was the kind of girl they all knew. The one who watered plants for the elderly couple on Maple Street, the one who shoveled snow for free, the one who left thank you notes on the community board. People like her weren't supposed to disappear. Inside the Hale Street police station, Detective Marcus Hale stared at the empty whiteboard meant for missing persons. He wrote Valerie's name at the top before anyone else arrived. The marker squeaked across the board, And for a moment, the entire room fell still, as if everyone understood that this name would not leave the board for a very long time. Her parents sat in the hallway, hands intertwined so tightly their knuckles turned white. Her mother couldn't stop shaking. Her father couldn't stop looking at the front door, expecting Valerie to walk through it at any moment and say she was fine, that this was a misunderstanding, that the world wasn't as cruel as it felt. Officers fanned out across Reno, knocking on apartment doors, searching behind dumpsters, questioning night shift workers, scanning surveillance tapes from the nearby strip mall. Every corner looked ordinary. Every shadow felt suspicious. By noon, volunteers crowded the sidewalks with flyers. Strangers stapled Valerie's smile to every pole, every storefront, every mailbox. Her face looked back at a community struggling to make sense of the impossible. But with each passing hour, the truth settled deeper into their bones. Someone had taken her. Someone had watched her. Someone had waited for the exact moment she was alone. The first press conference happened just after 4 p.m. Her father stepped forward, gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His voice broke as he pleaded, "If you know anything, please. She's our whole world." A reporter asked whether the family feared the worst. Her mother didn't speak. Her silence was louder than any answer. As night returned, search teams combed through the riverbank by flashlight. Dogs barked at the water. A deputy found a footprint in the mud, deep, angled, heavier than a teenager's. Something in the air shifted. Hope didn't vanish, but it trembled. Back at home, her parents couldn't sleep. The living room lamp stayed on. Her bedroom door remained open, as if the house itself refused to let go. That first day changed everything. It marked the final moment anyone saw the world as safe. And in the middle of that long, unending night, one question kept echoing across Reno, whispered by cops, neighbors, and parents trying to pray past the fear. If she wasn't protected on her own street, then who is? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Detective Marcus Hale didn't waste a minute. At sunrise, he ordered a grid search starting from Pinecrest Road and stretching outward toward the dry Washoe Basin. Officers moved through the area in long, slow lines, boots crushing the frost. Radios crackling with tension, none of them wanted to name out loud. But the scene felt wrong from the start. There were no tire marks, no dropped belongings, no signs of a teenage girl fighting for her life on a street she trusted. Instead, the ground looked swept clean, untouched, like someone had planned this and planned it well. A neighbor claimed they heard a quick squeal of brakes, but couldn't say anything more. Another insisted they saw a man walking a dog around the same time, but later admitted they might have confused the day. A third claimed they saw Valerie pass their house, but their story shifted 3 different times before noon. Witnesses weren't helping. They were guessing, and those guesses were pulling the investigation in every possible direction. Meanwhile, Valerie's father insisted on joining every search party, pushing himself until officers begged him to stop. At one point, he collapsed near the drainage ditch, trembling, whispering, "She's here somewhere. I know she is." But she wasn't. The only physical clue found that day was a single silver bracelet in the weeds, the one she wore every day. It wasn't broken. It wasn't damaged. It looked like someone had placed it there, not dropped it. That detail chilled Marcus Hale more than anything else. Back at the station, phones rang nonstop. Tip lines filled with impossible leads, psychics, anonymous voices claiming to feel her energy. Every false direction cost them precious hours. And while the city tried to help, confusion was becoming their worst enemy. What Marcus didn't know yet, what no one could have known, was that the very first witness they interviewed would also become the first major mistake in this entire investigation. But that truth wouldn't surface for decades. Would you still fight for answers if the people giving them didn't even know the truth themselves? Detective Marcus Hale needed something, anything that resembled a lead. And when desperation mixes with pressure, suspicion has a way of settling on the easiest target, not the right one. That target became Eric Dalton, Valerie's quiet next-door neighbor. Eric was 26, introverted, worked nights at a delivery warehouse, and kept mostly to himself. He wasn't dangerous, he wasn't bold, he was simply different. And in moments like this, different becomes a crime in the eyes of a frightened community. A neighbor claimed they saw Valerie talking to a tall man the night she vanished. Eric was tall. Another said Eric acted strange the week before. Strange how, they couldn't say. Someone else swore they heard arguing from the Dalton home, but Eric lived alone, and the dates didn't match. Facts didn't matter. Fear did. Reporters circled his street like vultures. Headlines labeled him person of interest before he'd even been brought in. By day 3, Eric was no longer a name. He was a symbol of collective suspicion. Marcus Hale brought him in for questioning. Eric didn't fight, didn't protest, didn't call a lawyer. He just sat there, soft-spoken, nervous, blinking too much under the harsh interview lights. Exactly the kind of demeanor people misinterpret as guilt when it's really fear. Marcus asked where he was the night Valerie vanished. Eric said he was at work. His manager confirmed it. Time cards confirmed it. Surveillance confirmed it. But by the time he was cleared, the damage was already done. Neighbors refused to look him in the eye. His landlord asked him to consider moving for his own comfort. One woman at the grocery store turned her cart around the moment she saw him. Eric Dalton became a victim of the town's panic, and panic never apologizes. Marcus knew they had wasted days pulling apart the life of an innocent man, days they should have spent chasing the real threat, the one no one had suspected yet. And quietly, painfully, the case slipped further away. Would you trust your community to see the truth when fear is easier than facts? The first 48 hours in any missing person investigation are everything. Everyone in Reno knew that. Detectives, reporters, neighbors, even Valerie's own parents. But knowing it didn't stop those hours from slipping away, wasted on dead ends, noise, and panic disguised as progress. Detective Marcus Hale reviewed the timeline again and again, but every time he came back to the same awful truth. The hours that should have brought answers only created more confusion. At 10:14 p.m., Valerie left her shift at the Silvercrest Diner. At 10:28 p.m., a coworker claimed she saw Valerie walking toward Arlington Avenue. At 10:35 p.m., a passerby reported seeing a girl who looked like Valerie talking to a man near a parked car. At 10:50 p.m. by time, another witness swore she saw Valerie inside a different car, a red sedan. By 11:05 p.m. Someone else insisted Valerie got on a bus heading the opposite direction. Every witness meant well. Not one of them helped. People don't realize how unreliable memory becomes when fear takes over. Everyone in Reno wanted to be the hero, the one who saw the final clue. And the result was chaos disguised as cooperation. Hale spent entire nights pinning witness statements on a board only to rearrange them again at dawn. Nothing aligned, nothing matched, nothing made sense. Meanwhile, the real truth, whatever it was, slipped further away with every hour of contradiction. Valerie's parents, John and Marlene, lived those missing hours like open wounds. They sat in the station lobby day after day, clutching a photo of their daughter the way some people cling to prayer beads. Every time the door opened, they lifted their heads, hoping the detective coming through had something, anything, other than, "We're still working on it." They didn't sleep. They didn't eat. They just waited. On the third night, Marlene finally broke. She grabbed Marcus Hale by the arm and begged, voice shaking, "Please don't let her become a story people forget." It was the kind of plea that buries itself in a detective's bones and never leaves. But when Hale returned to his desk, the truth hit him. The case wasn't just stalling. It was collapsing. No leads, no direction, only noise. Reno moved on to the next headline. Hale didn't. He couldn't, because he knew something everyone else refused to admit. The person responsible for Valerie's disappearance was counting on those chaotic hours and winning. Time is supposed to heal. That's what people say. But in Reno, time didn't heal anything. It only covered the wound with a thin layer of convenience so everyone else could pretend it wasn't still bleeding. By the early 2000s, Valerie Hale's name had faded from conversations. New businesses opened, neighborhoods expanded, casinos swallowed entire blocks. And people who once searched for her now crossed the street to avoid talking about that summer. For the Hale family, though, time didn't move at all. Every room in their house still carried Valerie's presence. Her art on the walls, her textbooks on the shelf, her jacket still hanging by the door like she'd come back and grab it any minute. Her mother refused to pack a single thing away. She called it preserving hope. Her father called it the only way he knew how to stay sane. When the city cut funding for cold cases in 2004, Valerie's file was officially moved into long-term storage. The clerk who boxed it up didn't even know her name. But John and Marlene never stopped saying it. Not once. Not even when people grew tired of hearing it. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, they stood outside the Reno Police Department holding candles, sometimes with 5 people beside them, sometimes with none. They didn't care about the crowd. They cared about the promise. We will not let you be forgotten, even when the rest of the city already had. That contrast, a community forgetting while a family remembered with burning clarity, became its own kind of torment. Reno was loud, busy, thriving. The Hale home felt frozen, quiet, and heavy, like it was trapped inside the moment Valerie vanished. Some nights, neighbors saw Marlene standing in the driveway long after midnight, staring at the road her daughter walked the night she disappeared. She didn't wait for miracles anymore. She waited for truth. Because somewhere out there, someone knew something. Someone who never came forward. Someone who watched Reno forget and stayed silent anyway. And that silence, it was the cruelest part of all. While Reno moved on, one man refused to file Valerie Hale under past tragedy. Detective Elias Rowan had been a junior officer back in 1990, barely experienced, barely trusted, and barely old enough to understand what true evil looked like. But Valerie's case had sunk deeper into him than anyone realized. Even after he was removed from it, even after it went cold, he kept a copy of her missing poster folded inside his wallet for years. The crease marks eventually sliced straight through her smile. He never forgave himself for failing her. Rowan retired in 2012, but retirement didn't quiet the questions clawing at him. He still drove by the area where her bike was found. He still stood on the sidewalk outside the print shop that had once been a point of interest. He still replayed every interview, every mistake, every overlooked detail. His wife once found him sitting alone in the garage, listening to the old cassette recordings from the original investigation. He had the volume low, like he didn't want the walls to hear the pain in those tapes. Sometimes she'd ask, "Why that case after all these years? Why that one?" He'd just answer, "Because she deserved better." And he meant it. When Rowan passed away in 2016, his daughter found a sealed envelope in his desk labeled only with 2 words, "For Valerie." Inside was a handwritten note. No explanations, no apologies, only a single line that spoke louder than any report ever filed. "I never stopped looking for you." That note would remain unseen by police for years, but the weight of that unfinished promise lingered. Some things don't die because time passes. They die because people give up. Rowan never gave up. And even though he didn't live to see the truth, his persistence would eventually play a role in the case waking up again. Because when the world forgets, it's often the quiet, stubborn hearts who keep justice alive, even when no one is watching. Deep in the basement of the Washoe County Records Annex, there was a shelf no one touched anymore. Dust layered the boxes like a second skin, labels fading, tape peeling at the edges. Most cases on that shelf belonged to people the city had forgotten. Tragedies without endings, names whispered only by aging detectives who once cared. Valerie Hale's box sat there too, exactly where it had been abandoned in 1991. Its corners had softened from time, its handwriting smudged from years of neglect. The sticker on the front read H92 Warrant 4, but the ink had bled into the cardboard, making it look like a ghost of itself. In 2022, during a department-wide audit, a clerk named Jordan Ruiz was told to go downstairs and clear out the old stuff. It was supposed to be routine. Toss damaged photos, digitize what was salvageable, move the rest into long-term storage. He didn't expect anything inside those boxes to feel alive. But when he pulled Valerie's case file from the shelf, something strange happened. The tape seal snapped with a sound that echoed down the concrete hallway. Inside were items that should have been transferred years earlier. A torn sleeve from Valerie's jacket, soil samples, and a small paper envelope containing a strand of hair so thin it barely looked real. Attached was a note from 1990 that read, "Too small for analysis. Save for later." Later had finally arrived. Jordan stared at that note for a long time. Most clerks would have shoved it back into the box, filed it under unsolved, and moved on. But something about the careful handwriting, the kind detectives used before computers took over, made him stop. This wasn't junk. This wasn't clutter. This was someone's daughter. Instead of throwing the items into the discard bin, he carried the envelope upstairs and placed it directly on the desk of Captain Elena Briggs, head of the new cold case renewal initiative. She frowned when she saw the date. She frowned even deeper when she noticed the hair sample. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Jordan told her everything. The basement, the box, the eerie timing, the note left by detectives who probably thought the test would never exist in their lifetime. Briggs looked at the envelope again. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "This isn't coincidence. This is the case asking to be heard." Within 24 hours, the sample would be on its way to the state forensic lab, where technology finally had teeth sharp enough to bite into what time had left behind. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was momentum. It was the past, refusing to stay buried. It was the first breath of a truth waiting 32 years to speak. The first call came in at 8:14 a.m. Captain Elena Briggs was halfway through her coffee when the lab director's number flashed on her phone. She answered casually at first. She handled dozens of cold case submissions every month. But the tone in his voice straightened her posture instantly. "Captain, you need to hear this in person." Within 20 minutes, she was inside the forensic lab, standing beneath humming machines and bright overhead lights. The director handed her a printout, the kind that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't understand what it meant. But Briggs understood. Clear as day, no ambiguity, a viable male DNA profile, something the 1990 detectives could only dream of. She ran her finger down the edge of the page, reading the results again and again, as if repetition would make it less unbelievable. For 32 years, Valerie Hale's case had been marked by absence. No eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no usable evidence. Now, out of nowhere, the silence had cracked. Briggs exhaled slowly. "It's her case," she whispered. "It's speaking." The sample was moved immediately into the national database. Not the old CODIS system alone, but the expanded genealogical network created for cold cases almost exactly like this. A system built for stories that had slipped through time. At 3:07 p.m., the second call arrived. Partial match found. Living relative identified. Location, Sparks, Nevada. The room went quiet. The analyst clicked through the family tree diagram and paused on one familiar name. A name buried in the handwritten notes from the 1990 file. A name mentioned once and dismissed because the technology didn't exist to confirm a thing. A name that had lived in plain sight for decades. Captain Briggs stared at it, jaw tight, breath shaky. She wasn't looking at a stranger. She wasn't looking at a long-shot lead. She was looking at a descendant connected by blood to the man detectives once suspected, but could never prove. The weight of it hit her like a physical blow. Reno hadn't just forgotten Valerie Hale. It had shaken hands with the man who took her. It had waved to him at grocery stores. It had trusted him with its children. It had invited him into its safety. And for the first time in 32 years, the city felt the tremor of truth rising from underneath everything it thought it knew. Briggs closed the file with a slow, deliberate motion. "Reno," she said quietly, "you're about to remember her. Because cases don't wake up on their own. Evidence doesn't shout without reason, and the dead don't stay silent forever." This was no longer a story about what happened in 1990. It was about what was coming next. For years, the box sat untouched on a metal shelf, its label fading into the color of old dust. Most detectives didn't even know it existed. Those who did had been trained to look past it. Another unsolved case from the past, filed away because life kept moving and the city learned to look forward, not back. But Captain Elena Briggs wasn't built like the rest. On a quiet morning in early 2023, She unlocked the evidence room with a purpose she couldn't entirely explain. Something had been bothering her for weeks, a sense that one of their forgotten cases wasn't actually done speaking. The Hale file, with its brittle papers and incomplete interviews, had been appearing in her dreams like a shadow waiting to be addressed. She reached the far shelf, pulled out the old box, and carried it to her desk as if she were handling something sacred. Inside, the past was waiting. Old photographs, early witness statements, the half-burned flyer Valerie's family had printed, the fabric scrap with faint markings that technology in 1990 couldn't make sense of. Briggs placed the evidence under a lamp and felt her breath tighten. There was something there, something small, overlooked, forgotten. "I'm reopening this," she said aloud, even though no one else was in the room. Not for procedure, not for reputation, but because silence had lasted long enough. Briggs sent the fabric scrap and the biological trace to the newly upgraded forensic genome sequencing unit, a lab capable of recovering answers from materials smaller than a grain of dust. She requested priority testing. The technicians didn't question her. They knew the sound of a detective following instinct instead of orders. The new machines could map genetic codes with precision unheard of in the 90s. Every rotation of their internal chambers brought a truth closer to the surface. Hours turned into days. Days turned into a week. Briggs checked the lab status every morning before anything else. At 6:42 a.m. on a Wednesday, she got the alert. Viable DNA extracted. Profile being processed. She stared at the message, her heart thudding with a mix of dread and hope. The system started comparing the profile across millions of entries. Civilian databases, public genealogy uploads, lineage networks used specifically for cold cases. The wheels had finally begun to turn. Most detectives would have missed it, that faint trace of industrial coating on the fabric scrap. Back then it was dismissed as dirt, but the new database matched it to a specific kind of chemical used in printing machines during the late 80s and early 90s. Old printing machines, the kind found in small printed shops across Nevada. Briggs pulled out the list of shops from 1990 and cross-referenced it. One name kept coming up: Silverline Press, a once thriving business on the east side, closed in 2002 after multiple violations. A business run by Malcolm Thorpe, the same man who had given a statement in 1990, the same man whose timeline never fully lined up, the same man detectives brushed aside because he was cooperative. Briggs felt a chill crawl across her skin. If the evidence pointed where she thought it was pointing, Reno was about to get hit with a truth it had no idea was living among it. To avoid mistakes, Briggs called in Dr. Alistair Finch, one of the top forensic genealogists in the region. Finch had cracked cases deemed impossible. He had a way of turning family trees into roadmaps that led straight to the truth. When Briggs handed him the extracted DNA sequence, he didn't speak for a minute. He simply studied the numbers, the patterns, the markers that separated one lineage from another. "This isn't random," he finally said. "This belongs to someone whose family stayed local." He loaded the sequence into his system, tracing branches outward: cousins, uncles, distant matches, dormant family lines that had scattered across the country. But one line kept circling back to the same geographic point: Reno, 1990, Silverline Press. Finch glanced at Briggs. "This isn't a coincidence, it's not even close." For the first time, the case wasn't a theory. It wasn't hope. It wasn't desperate guessing. It was science pointing directly at a man who'd walked away 3 decades earlier. And the city had no idea what was about to hit it. The case didn't whisper this time. It screamed for justice. The room was quiet when the match appeared on Dr. Finch's screen. Too quiet for a truth so sharp. The genealogical map he'd built over several days suddenly tightened into a single branch. The kind of narrowing that never happened without reason. One name rose to the center like a bruise surfacing under skin: Malcolm Thorpe. Finch didn't speak at first. He simply stared, jaw tense, fingers hovering over the keyboard as if they weren't sure they wanted to touch the next step. When Captain Briggs walked in, he turned the monitor toward her. "This is the closest match we've had in the entire case," he said. "It's not a question of if, it's a question of how direct." Briggs leaned in. The bloodline connection wasn't distant. It wasn't hypothetical, it was immediate, the kind of match that eliminated doubt. Thorpe had been a name in the original file, a passerby, a man who cooperated fully, a neighbor who claimed he saw nothing. But the DNA didn't lie. Science didn't flatter reputations. Briggs inhaled slowly. "This is him," she whispered. Not anger, not triumph, just the weight of a truth that had waited 33 years to be acknowledged. Finch nodded. "We need direct confirmation. But this is enough to move." Briggs wasn't thinking about warrants or procedure in that moment. She was thinking about Amanda Collins, a girl who walked home in a blue jacket and never saw the inside of her house again. A girl whose parents had aged with unanswered questions carving lines across their faces. Now finally someone was answering, and the answer had a name the town never expected. Captain Briggs didn't rush. She knew justice required patience, the kind that made your stomach knot but kept your judgment clear. Malcolm Thorpe had lived in Reno for decades without a single accusation sticking to him. He'd coached youth sports, donated to charity, walked through grocery aisles with a smile like he had earned it. That kind of mask didn't crack easily, so surveillance started quietly. Two unmarked vehicles, alternating teams, long hours of stillness followed by brief bursts where Thorpe became active. Just enough movement to remind the detectives that they were trailing a man who didn't deserve the calm life he enjoyed. He moved like someone who had nothing to hide, and that irritated Briggs the most. He shopped, he chatted with neighbors, he watered his lawn every morning at 6:15. Routine, predictable rhythms, the luxury of someone who never lost sleep over what he'd done. But the detectives did. One afternoon, Thorpe sat outside a cafe, sipping coffee, scrolling through his phone. It was the perfect opportunity. Briggs gave a low command through the radio. "Wait until he leaves it on the table." Patience, stillness, a quiet hunt. Thorpe eventually wiped his mouth with a napkin, folded it once, set it down, and stood to leave. He stretched slightly, harmless, ordinary, then walked back toward his car. The second he disappeared inside, a plainclothes officer stepped in fast and smooth, sliding the napkin into an evidence sleeve without breaking stride. No one at the cafe even noticed. Not the barista, not the customers, not Thorpe himself. But science noticed, and it was waiting. Back at the forensic lab, Finch held the sealed napkin like it carried the echo of a 30-year-old cry for help. He ran the test without speaking, eyes locked on the machine. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Briggs stood behind him, arms crossed so tightly her fingers numbed. Then the result printed. Sharp, undeniable, merciless. Direct match. Not distant, not partial, not debatable. Malcolm Thorpe wasn't connected by ancestry. He was the source. Briggs exhaled once, slow, steady, almost shaking. For 3 decades, this man had walked free. For 3 decades, Amanda's mother had carried grief through every season. For 3 decades, the truth had been buried beneath his polite smile. But now the mask had slipped, and the real Malcolm Thorpe finally had nowhere left to hide. Captain Briggs didn't call Amanda's parents right away. She sat at her desk with the lab report in front of her, the page that confirmed every fear, every suspicion, every nightmare the Collins family had lived through since 1990. She knew this call would not bring comfort. It would not bring peace. It would only bring truth. And truth often hurt more than silence. At 7:42 p.m., she finally dialed. Lydia Collins answered on the second ring. Her voice was soft, older than it should have been, and carried the weight of 3 lost decades. "Captain, did you find something?" Briggs closed her eyes. "Yes, we did." There was a long pause. Not the kind filled with fear, the kind filled with exhaustion. Because Lydia had waited so long, that hope became painful. "Is it him?" she asked. "The man who took my daughter?" Briggs didn't soften the answer. "Yes, ma'am. We have a confirmed DNA match." The sound that came next wasn't a cry. It wasn't a scream. It was a breath, one that broke apart halfway through, like a heart folding in on itself. Lydia whispered, "I always knew someone out there was living their life like nothing happened." Briggs didn't interrupt. He was probably eating dinner. Lydia said, voice trembling. Laughing, sleeping, while my daughter never even finished her last walk home. Then the phone shifted hands. Thomas Collins came on, voice rough like gravel scraping against metal. Tell me his name, he said. Malcolm Thorpe, Briggs replied. Silence. Then Thomas said something Briggs would never forget. He searched with us. He stood beside me while I held my wife so she wouldn't collapse. He knew. He knew the whole time. Briggs felt that one hit her body like a brick. It was always more painful when the monster had once been close enough to shake your hand. Thomas's breathing grew louder, harsher. Don't let him sleep in his own bed. Again. Don't let him have one more sunset. Not one. You have my word, Briggs said. Lydia came back on the line, her voice smaller now. Thank you. Thank you for not letting her be forgotten. Briggs swallowed hard. She never was. When the call ended, the captain placed the phone gently on her desk and sat in silence. Not because she doubted the next step. Arresting Thorpe would happen soon, and it would be decisive. But because she understood what justice actually felt like for families. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like surviving another kind of loss. After the DNA confirmation, Captain Briggs pulled every archived photo, every newspaper clipping, and every piece of testimony from the original case file. She spread them across the long conference table, creating the timeline the town had never truly seen. And there he was, Malcolm Thorpe, appearing in almost every key moment. Not because he helped, but because he wanted to look helpful. A series of images told a story no one had dared to read. Photo number 1, July 1990. Volunteers lined up near the creek. Thorpe stood in the second row holding a flashlight. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking past the crowd, toward the place where Amanda would later be found. Photo number 2, community prayer circle. Parents weeping, students embracing. Thorpe had his arm around a grieving neighbor, his face soft, comforting. Too comforting. Photo number 3, detectives briefing the public. The crowd looked terrified. Thorpe looked calm. Photo number 4, Amanda's funeral service flyer pinned to a bulletin board. On the corner of the image, barely in frame, Thorpe's hand could be seen reaching to adjust the flyer, like he wanted it straight, like he wanted to be part of the tragedy he created. Briggs leaned back and whispered to herself, he never left the story. He just hid in plain sight. Detective Reyes stepped inside the room as Briggs studied the wall. You see it now too? Reyes asked quietly. Briggs nodded. He didn't come back to help. He came back to watch. The flashbacks deepened when Reyes pulled the old interview audio. Thorpe's voice, steady, polite, almost bored, filled the room. I didn't know the girl. I just heard about the search and wanted to do my part. But his tone had no urgency, no worry, no tremor, just a man playing a role he'd rehearsed too well. Reyes paused the tape. He lied without twitching. Briggs pointed to the torn backpack found near the creek. He dropped the first clue because he wanted the story to unfold slowly. He wanted attention, just not suspicion. Reyes swallowed. So he walked those fields knowing exactly where she was. Briggs answered softly, yes. Every flashback landed harder than the last, not because the evidence was new, but because the truth had always been there, hidden in the open. Thorpe had joined the search parties, held hands with the grieving, prayed at the vigils, offered coffee to exhausted officers, stood meters away from the crime scene. A man who wanted to look helpful, because he knew exactly when to stop searching. Briggs stepped closer to the board, her voice low but firm. He didn't just hide behind kindness. He used it. Reyes stared at the photos, her chest tight with anger. How many years did he sleep peacefully? She whispered, while the Collins family stayed awake. Briggs answered, too many. And then came the final realization, I am, the one that finished section 5. He searched for her, because he knew where to stop. The arrest happened just after sunrise, the same hour Jennifer Holt used to take her morning jog before she vanished in 1990. The air in Reno was cool, quiet, and still, the kind of morning where nothing feels dangerous. But for the task force gathered on Crestwood Lane, tension hit harder than the cold. Detective Anya Sharma stood at the front of the formation, her jaw locked, her gloves tight against her hands. She had spent months peeling back a truth the city had ignored, a truth that now stood behind the door of a modest blue house with peeling shutters and a wind chime that tinkled like a bad joke. Malcolm Hartley, the man who once searched for Jennifer, prayed at her vigil, comforted strangers with a smile he didn't deserve, had no idea the knock on his door would end the longest lie Reno had ever lived with. Sharma lifted her hand. 3 knocks. Firm, final. Inside, footsteps shuffled, slow and casual, like a man expecting a neighbor, not fate. The door cracked open, and Malcolm's face appeared in the gap. Older now, thinner, but his eyes still held that softness he used to fool an entire community. "Can I help you?" He didn't finish. Sharma's badge rose like a blade. "Malcolm Hartley, you're under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Holt." The shock that crossed his face wasn't fear. It was insult. The kind of expression guilty men wear when the world finally stops believing their disguise. Officers pulled him into the morning light. His slippers scraped across the concrete. His robe fell open at the chest. The wind chime above him sang softly as he was handcuffed. A strange, almost mocking soundtrack to the moment Reno had been waiting for since 1990. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A dog barked in the distance. Someone gasped loudly enough for the officers to hear. Sharma didn't blink. For her, this wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth finally standing up straight. As Malcolm was led to the car, he turned once, toward the street where 30 years earlier, Jennifer Holt had been last seen alive. No words, no apology. Just a stare that confirmed everything Sharma already knew. He hadn't been hiding in fear. He had been hiding in comfort, and Reno had let him. Sharma shut the squad car door herself, her voice steady, her anger controlled. "You watched this town break for decades," she whispered. "Now it's your turn." The car pulled away, taillights glowing red against the pale morning. Reno had just witnessed the end of a lie, and the beginning of a reckoning. The arrest was only the beginning. Within minutes of taking Malcolm into custody, investigators entered his home with a warrant that felt decades overdue. Sharma walked in first, the silence pressing against her ribs like weight. Every step into that house felt like trespassing into a lie Reno had unknowingly protected for 30 years. The living room was painfully ordinary. A recliner, a bookshelf, a grandmother-style lamp. Nothing about the space suggested darkness, and that, more than anything else, made Sharma feel sick. People like Malcolm always looked harmless until you opened the drawers they thought no one would ever dare touch. In the hallway closet, officers found boxes stacked neatly, labeled with dates that meant nothing to anyone except him. Inside the first box was a collection of random items, matchbooks, ticket stubs, store receipts, nothing criminal, but all unsettling in the way they were saved, almost cataloged. The second box changed everything. Officer Daniels lifted the lid and the room froze. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in a faded towel. Sharma reached for a pair of gloves, her fingers trembling even before she knew what she was about to uncover. She peeled back the fabric layer by layer, then stopped breathing. Jennifer's gold bracelet. The same bracelet her mother had described over and over during the original investigation. The same bracelet the police insisted might have been lost somewhere else. The same bracelet the case file claimed had never been recovered. Sharma closed her eyes for a moment, not out of shock, but out of rage. Malcolm had kept it for 3 decades, not buried, not hidden far away, kept close, because people like him didn't lose trophies. They cherished them. Further inside the box were photographs, unmarked, unstamped, but unmistakably connected to the summer of 1990. Shots of forest trails, creek beds, dirt paths, places Jennifer might have been taken, places no one had searched long enough. A third box held something worse, a denim jacket folded too carefully, as though it belonged to someone he loved. When Sharma lifted it, a soft cloud of dust rose into the air, and she recognized the stitching immediately. The patch pocket Jennifer's mother had sewn for her that spring. Sharma's throat tightened. This wasn't evidence. This was a confession in cardboard. In the garage, officers opened a tool chest larger than most refrigerators. And there, tucked beneath old wrenches and oil-stained rags, they found a small mason jar sealed with tape. Inside were hair strands, thick, dark, unmistakable. The DNA lab would confirm it in hours, but Sharma already knew. They had found the truth he'd been protecting. The truth he'd built a life on top of. The truth Reno had unknowingly walked past every day. Detective Daniel spoke quietly, almost afraid of his own voice. He never threw anything away. Sharma answered with a low, controlled fury. He didn't need to. No one ever looked. For a moment, no one moved. Not because they were afraid, but because they understood exactly what they were standing in. 30 years of stolen peace. 30 years of someone else's life tucked into boxes. 30 years of a killer hiding in plain sight. As the evidence team sealed the items and carried them out one by one, neighbors gathered again on the sidewalk, watching the fragments of a nightmare emerge from the home of a man they once trusted. Sharma didn't look at their faces. She kept her eyes on the boxes, on the truth that should have been uncovered in 1990, but wasn't. Not because evidence was weak, but because the wrong man was believed, and the right man was allowed to grow old. For the first time in 30 years, the story was no longer buried. Reno wasn't ready for what would come next, but Sharma was. By the time the sun dipped behind the Reno skyline, the news had already spread faster than the officers could process the evidence. Helicopters hovered overhead, reporters crowded the street, and neighbors stood frozen on their porches, staring at the patrol cars parked in front of a home they used to walk past without a second thought. Some cried openly, some whispered, but most just stared, unable to believe the man they waved to for 30 years had carried a secret this heavy. One woman clutched her son's hand and kept repeating, "He fixed our car last month. He knew my boy's name." Her voice cracked on the last word as if her throat refused to finish the sentence. Reno wasn't angry, not yet. It was stunned, hit with a kind of shock that emptied the body before the mind had time to catch up. Inside the police station, the air felt 10 degrees colder than usual. Reporters were already pushing against the front doors, demanding statements, angles, answers. But the public affairs officer held them back until Detective Sharma stepped forward. She didn't stand behind the podium. She didn't smile for cameras. She didn't soften her tone. She carried the weight of 30 years of silence. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise, it cut. At 6:43 this morning, the suspect in the 1990 disappearance of Jennifer Hart was taken into custody. Evidence recovered from his residence directly connects him to her abduction and death. Gasps filled the lobby. Pens stopped moving. Even the clicking cameras slowed for a breath. Sharma continued, eyes steel-focused. For decades, Jennifer's family lived in a world that offered no answers. Today that changes. A reporter shouted, "How did he avoid detection for so long?" Sharma didn't flinch, because no one looked close enough. Her words were sharp, unfiltered, the kind that make a city rethink everything it believes about itself. The statement wasn't meant to shame, it was meant to wake people up. Another voice from the crowd yelled, "Was he targeting anyone else?" Sharma locked eyes with the camera, not accusing, not softening. Just telling a truth Reno needed to hear. When a person can hide like this, nothing is impossible. Outside, the crowd grew louder, fear mixing with disbelief. Parents pulled their children closer. Elderly residents shook their heads in stunned betrayal. One man muttered, "I helped him shovel his driveway every winter." Another said quietly, "Monsters don't always show teeth." The press conference ended, but the shock spread like wildfire. Social media erupted. Streets buzzed with conversations that felt too heavy for strangers to share, yet too frightening to keep silent. Reno, a city used to dust storms and neon, had never seen anything like this kind of storm. A storm of truth, a storm of guilt, a storm of realizing the man smiling at the grocery store might have been smiling at a memory no one else knew existed. Detective Sharma stood outside for a moment, watching the crowd ripple with grief and confusion. She didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. Responsible for making sure no one lied to themselves about safety ever again. Because safety wasn't a streetlight. It wasn't a friendly wave. It wasn't the comfort of living in a place where everyone knows everyone. Safety was knowing the truth, even when it shattered. And tonight, Reno felt the break. When Jennifer Hart's parents stepped up to the podium that evening, the room went silent in a way no reporter, no officer, no camera could create on their own. It was the kind of silence that comes only when grief finally has the chance to speak. Her mother, Linda, held a worn photograph pressed against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her husband, Daniel, stood beside her with hands trembling just enough to reveal the truth. 30 years had not softened anything. 30 years had only sharpened the edges. Linda took a breath that seemed to pull the entire room into her lungs. Her voice cracked on the first word. We waited and waited and waited. Every syllable carried the weight of nights she couldn't count, birthdays she couldn't celebrate, and prayers that felt like they were thrown into a void. She lifted the photos so the cameras could see it. This was our daughter. She wasn't a case. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a mystery. She was ours. A reporter wiped away tears. Another lowered their camera, unable to keep filming. Daniel stepped forward. His voice wasn't steady, but it was honest. For years, we begged people to look again, to try again, to not forget her. Some listened. Most didn't. He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the floor. But one detective did. Detective Sharma, thank you for not letting her story disappear. Sharma, standing off to the side, lowered her gaze, overwhelmed but steady. Linda continued, gripping the podium as though it were the only thing anchoring her. For 30 years, we lived with a question that ate everything, our sleep, our hope, our faith. Today, we finally have an answer. She didn't say the suspect's name. She refused to give him even that much. Instead, she looked straight into the cameras, into millions of unseen faces watching from their living rooms, and delivered a sentence that hit harder than any headline. Evil isn't always a stranger. Sometimes it's the familiar smile you never think twice about. The room shook with quiet sobs. A reporter finally whispered, Mrs. Hart, what do you want people to learn from this? Linda lifted her head with a steadiness she had not shown until now. Pay attention. Don't ignore your instincts. And don't wait until the truth knocks, because by then it might already be too late. Her voice broke again, but she finished with a final blow. If this could happen to our daughter, it can happen anywhere. The crowd fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical, like grief had filled every inch of air. When the Hart family stepped away, even the cameras seemed unsure whether to continue rolling. No one clapped, no one moved, because some truths don't need applause, they just need to be heard. When investigators finally stepped into Thomas Granger's old workshop, they expected clutter, rust, and dust. What they did not expect was a preserved time capsule of secrets, one that had waited 3 decades for someone brave enough to open it. The air inside the shop felt stale, unmoved for years. Shelves sagged under the weight of old tools. A cracked window filtered in a stripe of pale morning light, revealing floating dust that seemed to freeze in place as the officers entered. Detective Sharma's flashlight swept across the room once, twice, before stopping. On the back wall, behind a stack of wooden crates, something metallic glinted. Move these aside, she said, her voice tighter than usual. Officers shifted the crates and revealed a small, locked cabinet, the kind that doesn't look important until you open it. The lock was old, brittle, almost as if it expected someone to finally force it open. Inside were items no one wanted to see, yet everyone knew were coming. A faded bracelet, a small notepad with frayed edges, a strip of fabric that matched the shirt Jennifer Hart wore the night she vanished, a glass jar holding a broken hair clip. Each object had been placed with intention, stored the way a collector protects things that matter. Sharma didn't speak. She didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than any confession ever could. On the top shelf, inside a sealed envelope, officers found something that froze the room. Jennifer's birthstone pendant. The same pendant her mother had saved up for months to buy her. The same pendant the family searched for endlessly after she disappeared. Sharma held it in her gloved hands for only a second before stepping back, overwhelmed by the gravity of what she was touching. On the floor beneath the cabinet, investigators uncovered a large wooden box. They opened it slowly, cautiously, as if afraid of what they'd find. Inside were Polaroid photos, old, yellowing, but unmistakable. Photos from the night Jennifer vanished. Sharma's breath caught in her throat. One picture showed the turn near Carson Avenue. Another showed Jennifer's satchel lying open. A third, the one no one wanted but everyone needed, showed a shadowed figure beside her collapsed pencil case. The photos didn't just tell a story. They proved it. Across the room, a small freezer hummed faintly. An officer opened it and immediately stepped back, stunned. Inside were bone fragments wrapped carefully in butcher paper. Fragments later confirmed to belong to multiple victims. But Jennifer's were among them. This was no accident. No misunderstanding, no misidentification. This was deliberate, calculated, preserved. Sharma stepped outside for air, but even the open sky felt too small for everything she had just seen. Her voice cracked as she radioed in. "We found what we needed, every answer, every truth, because some evidence doesn't just point to guilt. It screams it. The long, agonizing question that haunted a family for 30 years finally had a reply. Jennifer didn't vanish into thin air. She was taken. She was kept. And she was hidden by a man the community trusted. The case that once collapsed under doubt now stood stronger than concrete. There would be no appeals, no confusion, no second chances. The evidence ended the story that grief started. News travels fast in a small city, but the word that spread through Reno that morning didn't move. It exploded. One officer whispered the update at the station, another repeated it on the phone, and within an hour the truth hit the community like a punch to the chest. Thomas Granger wasn't just arrested. He was guilty. Completely, undeniably guilty. People who once waved at him across their lawns froze at the news report. Neighbors who shared potlucks with him dropped their groceries when they heard his name. Mothers who trusted him to repair their cars felt physically sick. The idea that someone they knew, someone they respected, had been carrying a nightmare inside him for 30 years left the town shaken to its core. Outside the police station, a crowd gathered quietly. No chanting, no yelling, just stunned faces. A few people cried without wiping their tears. Others stared into the distance as if trying to rewrite every memory they had of the man. One woman whispered, "He fixed my brakes last month." Another said, "He read stories to our kids at the festival." And an older man added, "I shook his hand every Sunday." The betrayal didn't just hurt, it rearranged something in people. Inside the station, Jennifer's parents were brought into a private room. When Detective Sharma told them what was found in Granger's workshop, her voice softened, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. Jennifer's father lowered his head into his hands. Her mother let out a sound so raw it made even the officers outside the door stop breathing for a moment. Closure is supposed to feel peaceful. What they felt was devastation mixed with relief, a relief that carried guilt, because it meant accepting the truth they had prayed would never be real. Outside, the local news cameras flickered to life. Reporters urged the community to stay calm. But how do you stay calm when the person who stole a girl's life also fixed your porch light? When the same man who waved from his driveway had a freezer full of secrets? Curiosity turned into fear. Fear turned into outrage. Outrage turned into heartbreak. A mother in the crowd said quietly, "He was at the church picnic the year she disappeared." Someone else answered, "He helped search the fields that morning." That was the breaking point. It wasn't the arrest. It wasn't the evidence. It was the realization that the man who destroyed one family had stood shoulder to shoulder with the rest of them, pretending to care, pretending to comfort, pretending to be one of them. The community didn't just lose trust, they lost something deeper, the illusion that evil always looks unfamiliar. By sunset, the crowd outside the police station had doubled. Some held candles, some held each other, and some stood alone, trying to understand how they missed what was right in front of them. Reno wasn't the same city anymore. It couldn't be. The truth had arrived, and it didn't ask permission before breaking everything open. Reno had seen storms before, but none like this. None that tore through memories, friendships, and trust the way the truth about Thomas Granger did. The city woke up that morning believing they lived in a place where danger came from elsewhere. By nightfall, they realized it had lived among them, walking the same sidewalks, shopping in the same stores, waving from the same porches. At City Hall, phones rang nonstop. Parents demanded answers. Teachers asked whether the schools would address the news. Local businesses scrambled to distance themselves from Granger's repair shop, peeling his business cards off community boards and removing his name from old sponsorship lists. At the diner where Jennifer once ate after school, regulars sat in stunned silence. The cook wiped the same counter over and over, lost in thought. A teenager broke the silence by saying, "My mom said he fixed our mailbox when I was little." No one knew what to say back. The room just grew heavier. Church leaders held an emergency gathering. They stood at the pulpit, saying words meant to comfort families, but even they looked shaken. One woman in the front row whispered, "He prayed next to us." Someone behind her muttered, "He helped carry the tables for the harvest dinner." The pastor's voice trembled as he said, "We must accept that danger doesn't always wear a warning." The police station became both a fortress and a target. Reporters waited outside like wolves trying to catch a glimpse of anything. Angry residents demanded to know how this man slipped through the cracks for 3 decades. Officers who once greeted him during traffic stops now felt sick, remembering how calmly he smiled. Detective Sharma addressed the press late afternoon. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of every detail she couldn't unsee. She said, "Justice doesn't depend on the years that passed. Justice depends on the truth we're willing to confront." The crowd didn't applaud. They absorbed it like a blow to the chest. Social media exploded. Locals argued, defended, denied, and questioned each other. Some refused to believe he was guilty. Others felt ashamed they ever trusted him. A few admitted they had always felt something off, but fear or politeness kept them quiet. Meanwhile, Jennifer's old classmates shared photos of her online, smiling at a school dance, blowing out candles, hugging her friends in the hallway. The post went viral across the city. People began commenting things like, "How did we not see it?" Or, "We failed her without meaning to." The worst part wasn't the crime. It was the way it rewrote everyone's past, forcing them to re-examine the tiny interactions they once overlooked. By early evening, candles lined the sidewalk outside the police station. Some held signs with Jennifer's name. Others held nothing but their grief. A father pulled his daughter close and whispered, "Don't walk home alone anymore." Another parent said, "Check in with me every hour." Fear reshaped the rules of daily life. Reno wasn't simply reacting to a crime. It was grieving the loss of its own innocence. The realization that trust is fragile and safety can be a lie told by routine. The city would recover, but it would never forget. Inside the Reno interrogation room, time felt different. The walls were close, the air unmoving, and Thomas Granger sat with his hands folded like he was waiting for a church service to begin, not for the truth to finally corner him. For hours, he offered nothing but quiet, empty answers, the kind that say a lot without saying anything at all. Detective Sharma didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten him. She simply laid out every piece of evidence on the table, one by one. Jennifer's bracelet, the soil analysis, the DNA match from his discarded coffee cup, photographs he thought he destroyed. Each item landed like another crack in the mask he'd worn for 30 years. He kept insisting he had no reason to harm her, no connection, no motive. But the longer he spoke, the more his voice lost shape, stretching thin, breaking in places he tried to hide. Sharma leaned forward and whispered the sentence that shattered everything. "You searched for her with her parents. Why do that if you already knew where she was?" For the first time all day, Thomas Granger stopped breathing normally. His fingers twitched, his jaw tightened. He stared at the table, and something inside him finally slipped, the part of him that had held the lie together for decades. He said nothing at first, just a soft, broken exhale. Then came the words he had spent a lifetime pretending he didn't know how to say. "I never meant for it to go that far." Detective Sharma froze in place. Not triumph, sorrow. Because confessions don't heal anything. They only confirm what the families feared was true all along. He spoke in short bursts, each one colder than the last. He admitted seeing Jennifer walking alone. He admitted stopping his truck. He admitted persuading her to talk, then losing control when she tried to walk away. The details were not shouted. They were delivered like he was describing someone else's actions. Calm, empty, as if the reality of what he had done had dissolved so completely in his mind that he no longer understood the weight of it. What he didn't admit, ever, was guilt. Only mistakes. Only moments he couldn't explain. Sharma made him repeat his words clearly while the room recorded every syllable. There was no emotion in his voice, no apology, no shame. Only a man who had finally run out of places to hide. When the confession ended, he sat back and whispered, "I thought it would stay buried." Sharma replied quietly, "The ground keeps secrets. Science doesn't." The officers entered to take him back to holding. His expression didn't change. He didn't fight. He walked with the same calm stride he used at the grocery store, at the hardware shop, at the neighborhood block parties. The same calm stride he used the night he took a young girl's life. But now everyone would know the truth behind that calm. For the first time in 30 years, the final wall of lies had fallen, and there was no rebuilding it. When the news of Thomas Granger's confession reached Reno, it felt like a fault line tearing through the city. A man they trusted, a man who fixed neighbors' fences, waved at children riding bikes, and stood at every charity event, had finally spoken the truth everyone prayed they'd never hear. Phones rang nonstop. People gathered on sidewalks in clumps, whispering in voices thick with disbelief. Some cried openly, mourning a loss they never fully understood until now. Others were angry, not quiet anger, but the kind that shakes you down to the bone. Because betrayal doesn't just hurt. It stains everything that once felt safe. Those who lived near Granger couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the monster he had just revealed himself to be. A neighbor who had shared barbecues with him for 25 years stood on her porch with shaking hands, whispering, "He held my baby once. Oh God, he held my baby." At the local grocery store, employees tore down the missing posters that still hung out of respect for Jennifer. They folded them gently, as if touching something sacred, something the town had failed to protect decades earlier. Parents clutched their children tighter that evening. Teenagers walked home in groups instead of alone. Doors that once stayed unlocked during the day were bolted shut even in daylight. The betrayal didn't stop at the neighborhood lines. Church groups met in stunned circles. Community boards lit up with arguments, accusations, fear, denial. Former co-workers of Granger wondered out loud how they never saw anything. The hardest blow came from the families who had volunteered in 1990, the ones who had searched the fields with him, passed him flashlights, prayed beside him. They felt used. They felt tricked. They felt violated. A man who pretended to help them find Jennifer was the same man who already knew she would never be found alive. Reporters swarmed Reno so fast it looked like a city under siege. Cameras flashed. Microphones pressed against faces. Everyone wanted to comment. But what could they say? How do you describe the feeling of realizing your town was living next to danger, shaking hands with it, trusting it? Detective Sharma held a brief press statement that afternoon. She didn't deliver victory. She didn't smile. She stood behind the podium with the look of someone who understood the cost of truth and the weight of it. Her only words were, "Justice took 34 years, but justice arrived." The city needed that sentence. It didn't heal them. It didn't erase the fear, but it reminded them that Jennifer's voice had finally been heard, even through decades of silence. By nightfall, Reno wasn't celebrating. There were no cheers, no applause, no sense of triumph. Just a city standing in the glow of streetlights, trying to understand how danger hid so easily in plain sight. The final breaking point wasn't anger. It wasn't shock. It was grief. A shared grief the whole community carried together for the first time. Because now they knew the truth. Jennifer's killer didn't come from somewhere far away. He lived among them. When detectives finally reached the Harper family's home that evening, the porch light was already on. The same porch light that had burned for 34 straight years, never once turned off, never once losing its reason for shining. Jennifer's mother, Evelyn, opened the door with a stillness that felt too heavy for one person to carry. She didn't cry at first. She didn't scream or fall apart. She simply listened, hands trembling, breath uneven. As Detective Sharma gently explained what Granger had admitted, every sentence landed like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking fast, dragging everything with it. For a moment, the house went silent. Not quiet, silent. A silence so deep that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Then Evelyn whispered four words that shattered the room. I knew she didn't run. She said it again, this time through tears. I knew she didn't run. I knew. I knew. Her husband, Thomas Harper, closed his eyes and leaned against the doorway, as though the truth weighed too much for his legs to support. He had spent decades replaying every moment of that night, wondering if he had missed something, done something wrong, failed in some way. Hearing the truth didn't give him peace. It exposed the pain he had buried to survive. Jennifer's brother Michael stood behind them, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He helped us search, he said, voice cracking. He ate at our table. He hugged my mom. He stood next to Dad like they were friends. Anger didn't come in shouts. It came in a cold, shaking disbelief, the kind that leaves you breathless. Detective Sharma stayed with them longer than protocol required. Not as an officer, as a human being. She answered every question she could, and when she couldn't, she simply stayed present, knowing some moments demand witness rather than explanation. Evelyn eventually walked to the old hallway wall where Jennifer's photographs still hung. She touched one, a smiling school picture with bright eyes, and whispered, "Baby, they finally heard you." It wasn't closure, it wasn't healing, but it was truth, something they had been denied for more than half a lifetime. Later that night, after the detectives left and the neighborhood fell quiet, the Harper family gathered in their living room. No television, no lights except the lamp in the corner. Just them, holding on to each other as though the years of grief had finally caught up and refused to loosen its grip. For the first time since 1990, Evelyn turned off the porch light. Not because she was giving up, but because her daughter wasn't missing anymore. By the next morning, news vans lined the street outside the Reno Police Department like vultures waiting for a body to hit the ground. Cameras were already rolling before anyone stepped up to the podium. The town had lived under a cloud of unanswered questions for 34 years, and now every reporter wanted to be the first to break the truth open. At 9:02 a.m., Captain Elena Reyes stepped forward. Her face carried the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but also the steadiness of someone who knew. This moment mattered too much to rush. The murmurs faded, microphones angled forward. The world waited. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't soften her tone or try to protect anyone's memory but Jennifer's. Last night, she said, James Granger confessed to the killing of Jennifer Harper in 1990. The crowd inhaled sharply as though a single breath had been shared across the entire city. Reyes continued, her voice firm but weighted. He lived here. He worked here. He raised a family here. He attended community events. He was trusted. And for more than 3 decades, he allowed this family, in this city, to grieve without answers. Gasps rippled forward. Even seasoned reporters looked shaken, some lowering their cameras for a moment, as if trying to absorb the reality of those words. A journalist near the front asked, "Captain, did he show any regret?" Reyes didn't hesitate. "No, not once." Another reporter pushed forward. "Captain, how did he hide this for so long?" She looked out across the crowd, eyes narrowing, jaw tight. Because he was the kind of man people didn't question. That must never happen again. Behind her, Detective Sharma watched the press, her shoulders tense, her eyes weary but unwavering. She'd spent months fighting for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt both victorious and heartbreaking. This wasn't triumph, it was truth, and truth always cuts both ways. A final question rose from the back. What happens now? Reyes answered quietly, almost like she was speaking directly to Jennifer's family instead of hundreds of onlookers. Now, she said, we give her the justice she deserved 34 years ago. The microphones dropped, the cameras flickered, and in that instant the city realized something terrifying. The monster they'd feared for decades didn't come from the shadows. He came from their own neighborhood. Reno didn't simply react, it recoiled. When James Granger's name hit the evening broadcasts, the entire city seemed to stop breathing. Neighbors who once waved to him every morning now stared at their screens in disbelief, trying to reconcile the man who taught their kids how to fix a lawnmower with the man who had stolen a young girl's life. Phones buzzed nonstop. Doors that were usually left unlocked before sunset were suddenly bolted shut. Parents pulled their children closer without realizing it. The idea that a killer had lived among them for decades wasn't just unsettling, it felt like a personal insult. At the grocery store, people gathered in tense clusters near the produce aisle, whispering like the truth itself might shatter if spoken too loudly. "I let him shovel my driveway last winter," one woman said, voice trembling. "My son worked in his garage," another added. "He joked with him, trusted him." Every story was the same: kindness mistaken for safety, familiarity mistaken for innocence. Meanwhile, those who had defended him the loudest now avoided eye contact with their neighbors. Some deleted old photos from community events. Others scrubbed his name from charity lists, anything to erase the sickening knowledge that they once admired him. But the deepest shock belonged to the families who had lived through 1990. The ones who remembered Jennifer Harper, like she was still sitting in the school cafeteria, or finishing her shift at the bookstore, or walking through the parking lot that night before she vanished. For them, this was betrayal on a level that language couldn't mend. Detective Sharma drove through the neighborhood that evening and watched the transformation unfold. Porch lights burning earlier, faces pressed against curtains. The quiet heaviness of a city realizing it had been fooled by a smile for 34 years. One thought had echoed everywhere: Jamar, unspoken but powerful. If we didn't see this, what else have we missed? And that fear, that doubt, swept through Reno harder than any storm. By the time the sun set over Reno that evening, the weight of the truth had already cracked through the city's spirit. It wasn't the kind of news people debated. It was the kind that left them staring into space, wondering how something so cruel could live right across the street. At the Parker home, the air felt thick with memories that hadn't been touched in decades. The porch creaked under the feet of reporters gathering outside, but inside the world was painfully still. Clara Parker stood in the living room clutching Jennifer's old sweater, the one she used to wear on chilly mornings. She held it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Robert sat in his armchair, shoulders shaking in a way he tried to hide, even though there was nothing left to hide from. For 34 years, they had begged for someone to listen. For 34 years, they lived in a house where the clock had stopped in 1990, and now the truth had finally come, but it arrived like a broken gift, late and heavy. When they finally stepped onto their porch, the crowd went silent. Clara didn't read from a paper. She didn't need to. Every word had lived in her throat for half a lifetime. "He took her from us," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He walked past our home. He watched us grieve. And all this time, he knew." Robert's voice cracked as he added, "We survived on hope, even when everyone else moved on. We survived because she deserved justice. Today, she finally has it." A hush settled over the reporters, the neighbors, even the police officers standing guard. Everyone could feel the raw truth in the Parker's pain. Justice didn't heal. It only revealed how long the wound had been open. Clara looked out over the crowd, eyes tired but firm. To every parent still waiting for answers, don't stop. Don't ever stop. Her words hit Reno harder than any headline. This wasn't closure. This was endurance. This was what 34 years of unanswered nights looked like. And the town, shaken to its core, couldn't look away. The hours leading up to Hector Molina's confession felt like time was holding its breath. Inside the interrogation room, the air was stiff and unmoving, the kind that made every second feel heavier than the last. Hector sat with his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the steel tabletop as if he could hide inside the reflection. Detective Solis watched him carefully. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound the table, didn't use intimidation. She only placed two things in front of him: a photograph of Jennifer Parker and the DNA report that matched him with the evidence found near the creek in 1990. He flinched before he even touched them. "You've carried this for 34 years, Solis said quietly, "but the truth hasn't aged. You have." Hector swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he stared at Jennifer's photo. The smile, the innocence. the life he had stolen in one violent moment. His fingers trembled, tapping against the paper like a man trying to summon courage he never possessed. For a long time, he said nothing. Outside the room, officers huddled around the hallway windows, each one tense, waiting for the sound they'd been chasing for decades. The breaking of a lie. When Solis pushed the recording device forward, Hector whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't mean, it wasn't supposed." His voice broke, not out of sorrow, but out of the crushing realization that the lie he built his life on had just collapsed. Solis didn't look away. "Tell the truth," she said. "Not for you, for her." Something inside him cracked. His shoulders slumped, the mask he'd worn for half a lifetime slipping off all at once. With shaking breath, he began to speak. Quietly, then louder, the way a dam sounds when it finally gives. Every word he confessed dug deeper into the silence outside the room, traveling through the station like a shockwave. Officers who had never even been born when Jennifer vanished stopped in their tracks. Veterans leaned against the wall, eyes closed, absorbing the weight of the moment they had been waiting for since they wore their first badge. By the time Hector's confession ended, the room felt colder, emptier, but honest for the first time in decades. Detective Salas stood, steady and unshaken. She clicked off the recorder, slid Jennifer's photo back into its folder, and said the one thing that closed the chapter. "It's done." But for the Parker family watching the news that night, it wasn't done. It was the beginning of learning how to breathe again. Word of Hector Molina's confession spread across Reno faster than wildfire, hitting every corner of the city before sunrise. For most people, it was a name they'd lived alongside for decades. A neighbor, a coworker, the quiet man who kept to himself. No one had ever seen him as danger, and that's what made the truth hit so much harder. By morning, the streets buzzed with disbelief. People stood in small groups outside cafes and gas stations, whispering about the man who had walked among them since 1990 without raising a single suspicion. Some swore they had spoken to him just last week. Others tracked back through memories, trying to spot something they missed. A strange smile, a strange comment, anything. But there was nothing, and that emptiness was scarier than anything the city had faced before. Parents who once let their children walk to school began driving them instead. Doors that were always left unlocked were suddenly bolted shut. Reno's heartbeat didn't stop, but it stuttered. Local news stations replayed Hector's arrest on loop. The slow walk out of his home, his hands cuffed, his eyes lowered like a man who knew he had run out of shadows. Reporters used words like stunning, unthinkable, and long overdue, but the community didn't need headlines to tell them what they already felt, a mix of anger, relief, and betrayal. Detective Salas became the quiet anchor in the storm. At the press conference, she didn't smile or celebrate. Her voice was steady as she said, "Truth takes time, but it always finds a way back." She didn't embellish, she didn't dramatize. She respected the weight of what had been uncovered. For Jennifer Parker's family, watching from their living room, it was the moment they had prayed for and feared in equal measure. Clara Parker pressed a hand to her mouth as the screen showed Hector being led away. Robert Parker bowed his head, not in victory, but in exhaustion, the kind that comes when hope has been carried too long. Neighbors who once waved at Hector now avoided looking at each other, embarrassed at how easily kindness can hide danger. Because if he could walk among them unnoticed, who else could? And that quiet fear settled over Reno like a cold shadow. When detectives arrived at the Parker home to deliver the official confirmation, the house felt frozen in time. The same porch light Robert had replaced for 30 years still burned outside, a beacon that had once promised hope, but now flickered with the weight of reality. Clara sat on the edge of the couch, hands trembling in her lap long before anyone spoke. She didn't need words. Mothers always know before they're told. But when Detective Salas finally said the sentence she had carried across states, across years, across generations, "We have the man responsible for Michelle's disappearance," Clara let out a sound that didn't belong to this world. It was grief leaving the body after being trapped for too long. Robert didn't cry, not at first. He simply stood up, walked to the hallway where Michelle's framed school portrait hung, and placed his forehead against the glass. For decades, he had imagined this moment. Some version of justice, some hint of closure. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like loss gaining a voice. Clara asked only one question, her voice breaking on every syllable. Did she suffer? Solis didn't answer right away. She steadied herself before saying, "We believe it happened quickly." It wasn't an attempt to comfort, just the closest thing to truth she could offer. The room fell quiet, not peaceful, just heavy. Robert returned to the living room and sat beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders for the first time in years without shaking. They weren't the same people they were in 1970. Time had carved them into something quieter, something worn. But as they held each other, it was clear that this truth, painful as it was, had finally broken the lock on a grief that held them hostage for half a lifetime. Clara whispered, "She finally gets to rest." Robert answered, "And so do we." It wasn't freedom, but it was something close to breathing again. Outside, the porch light still glowed against the night, not as a call for a daughter to come home, but as a promise that her story had finally been seen, finally been heard, finally been answered. And in that fragile light, the Parker family felt the first quiet exhale of a chapter that had waited 30 years to end. The arrest, the trial, and the confession brought justice to the city, but the truth did something even deeper. It rewrote the silence that had hovered over Reno for more than 30 years. What had once been whispered about in grocery store aisles, avoided in classrooms, and brushed aside in police reports was finally spoken with clarity. Samantha Reyes was no longer the girl who never came home. She was a daughter, a friend, a voice the city should have heard long before science forced the world to listen. A memorial now stands near the old railroad crossing where her backpack was found. Locals leave flowers there, some who knew her, many who didn't, because her story is no longer just about loss. It's about what happens when a community learns to face its failures and move forward with honesty instead of shame. Detective Solis visits the memorial every year on the date Samantha vanished. She doesn't wear her badge on those days. She stands there as a human being, not an officer. She once said, "Justice isn't a moment. It's a promise you keep even when everyone else stops trying." For the people of Reno, that promise finally meant something. Samantha's family created a scholarship in her name, the Reyes Hope Grant, awarded to young women pursuing forensic science. Her mother said, "If someone had used science like this in 1990, maybe my daughter would have come home." The scholarship exists so that the next generation will have better tools, sharper eyes, and stronger courage. As years pass, her story continues to be taught in training rooms, classrooms, and community halls. Not because the pain deserves to stay, but because the lesson does. Samantha Reyes reminded Reno and the world that truth can sleep, but it never dies. It waits for the right voice, the right technology, the right moment to rise. Tonight, as you hear her story, remember this. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice. Stories like Samantha's don't just warn us, they wake us up. If this could happen in a quiet Reno neighborhood in 1990, it could happen anywhere. Stay aware, stay prepared, subscribe now, because the next cold case might be unfolding on your street, and you deserve to know the truth before it knocks on your door.